Now, these guys who invented the idea of apartheid, remember this goes back to the 1930s, they've been trying to persuade Afrikaners to vote for them. Because the guy who invents it, okay, is a man by the name of DF Malan. And he becomes the first prime minister in 1948. DF Malan is a Dutch reformed preacher man, okay? So that's his job, he's a preacher. And he's the guy, of course, who does this Christian nationalism thing. He invents this Christian nationalist idea. And he takes it over into politics. So he says, we want to have these separate national entities. And it's in Holland, they have the idea called verzuiling, which means separation into separate spheres. Okay. Now, for 30 years, these guys are trying to persuade Afrikaners to vote for them. Because they're saying to them, the British are going to wreck our country. The British, if you let the British carry on doing this, this country will eventually be run by semi-westernized black people. They will be the majority, we'll be a minority, we'll be done. That's a disaster. We can't allow that to happen.
So we're approaching 1948 and the Boer acquisition of political power. Tell us about that lead up.
These people who call themselves Christian nationalists and were trying to advocate for apartheid have been trying, for it's 20 years, roughly. They've been trying to sell this idea to Afrikaners to get them to vote for them. But, and it failed. They couldn't get these guys to vote for them. They were always a minority party. So, I guess you could say that it's like in Australian terms, a little bit like Pauline Hanson's One Nation just can never break out of the cycle of being the minority guys. Now, the reason that happened is that there were the electorate, the voters in South Africa had three choices. The one they had Jan Smuts, who was the British imperialist guy. So the empire is wonderful. We must just subsume ourselves into the empire. The other guy was a guy called Hertzog, who was a moderate nationalist. Now, Hertzog said, I have no problem with the British Empire. I have no problem with having the Queen as my queen. It's all good. As long as the British allow us Afrikaners a space for our own cultural autonomy, we can live alongside the English. In fact, our idea is to have a partnership between the English and the Afrikaans. We're all South Africans together, okay? And then the other guys, the Malan guys, the radical nationalists were going, no, we want our own state. We don't want to be part of the British Empire at all. Okay? So those are the three positions. And the person who got the most votes was always Hertzog, the kind of moderate guy. And he was the prime minister for years. Now, one of the things that he did was, Hertzog was responsible for the Statute of Westminster. So the South Africans and the Canadians wanted more autonomy within the British Empire. They wanted dominions effectively to have sovereignty within the British Empire. And it was the Canadian Prime Minister and Hertzog as the South African Prime Minister who at the conference fought for this and got the Statute of Westminster up. So Hertzog had said, I've been successful. There we are. We got our sovereignty. We have our independence. What's the problem? Whereas the radical nationalists were going, no. It doesn't work like that. The Brits still run the scene. They can stop this anytime they want. And obviously Hertzog kept winning the elections, right? Now comes the Second World War. Now the Second World War changes everything in favor of the National Party, the Malan nationalists. And two things in particular do this. The one is when Britain declares war against Germany, the majority of South African voters don't want to go to war. They want to be neutral. They don't support the Germans, but they don't support the British. We're going to be neutral. It was the same position as the Irish took, in fact. Exactly the same as the Irish position. Now, the British were horrified at this, didn't like this idea at all. At that stage, Hertzog was Prime Minister, Smuts was Deputy Prime Minister. Smuts clearly said, I'll go to war, no problem. So, the Governor-General, London told the Governor-General to fire Hertzog, which he did. Just fired the Prime Minister. Which is, you can imagine what the Whitlam thing did. I mean, this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. So Hertzog was fired and Smuts is made the Prime Minister. and declares war the next day. Okay. Now that was dynamite in the Afrikaner community. It also broke Hertzog as a man. I mean, it broke him as a person, because for years he'd saying, the British are good guys, what's the problem? And they had just proved him wrong. And everything he'd said for 20 years, basically. And he just went to pieces, basically. Okay. But anyway, what happened is the Nats, the Malan guys said, see, we always told you. We told you this is what would happen, didn't we? Now there we are. We have the proof. The Brits run the place, and when push comes to shove, this is what they do. So that was a big markup. And in fact, what then happened is Hertzog gave up politics. His electorate just moved over to these guys, boom, like that. But they still didn't have enough to actually become the government. Even if they'd been in an election, then they still would have lost. Okay. Anyway, next thing that happens was, during the Second World War, the Germans are bombing Britain, and it's quite difficult making your armaments if your factories are bombed every night. So what the British do is they move the manufacturing of munitions to the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa. And this is the point at which South Africa becomes a truly industrial state. So this is when South Africa, it's not just mining anymore. Johannesburg now becomes a truly industrial city, and it's all about making weapons for the British. But now this is happening at exactly the moment when white guys are being sent to North Africa to fight for the British. What's the Sixth Army, wasn't it? They fought with the Aussies in North Africa. So South African working class, white working class, is being exported to North Africa to fight for the Brits against Rommel. And it's the very moment when you're building all these new factories. There are no workers. Okay. Smuts solves the problem because, remember, Smuts is the segregation guy. And Smuts is the guy where South Africa, under the Union of South Africa, has always had a pass system. So it's an internal passport for black people. So black people can't just move wherever they want. They have to have a pass, which is stamped by their local magistrate or whatever it is, to say they have a job they're going to. Smuts wants black labor desperately in all these new factories. And he just lifts pass restrictions. This guy, I'm not going to enforce that anymore. Black guys, welcome. Come forth. Okay. And so suddenly, I mean, you've always had this mass importation of black labor anyway through the mining guys. Okay, had been bringing these guys in. But now it's just open slather. And black guys just pour into the cities. So if you look at a South African city in 1930s, they would have looked not unlike an Australian city. They were white settler cities. And black people lived out there in the tribal homelands. Black people were out there in the country. White people lived in the cities. That's what South Africa looked like. And Durban would have looked like Brisbane, for example. Now what happens is suddenly all these black guys turn up, okay, in a very short space of time during that period of the Second World War. That is exactly the time, for example, Mandela goes. Mandela moves to Johannesburg from the tribal area of where he comes from in the Transkei to Johannesburg at that time. All the leaders of the ANC moved at that time during the Second World War to Johannesburg, okay? So at the end of the war, all these white soldiers who'd been in North Africa and then in Italy come back to South Africa. What do they find? Their cities are black.
Transformed.
Literally transformed. It's like what you see in London now, where, you know, formerly British city becomes suddenly a Pakistani city. It's as stark as that. And all these guys are going, what happened? So now, first of all, they've just had this illustration about when they fired the Prime Minister. And now the Nats have got a really good piece of propaganda going. See, told you, there we go. Don't vote, the Brits are bad guys. And believe everything else we've been telling you about them as well. Plus, they turn up and the cities are now black. And it's horrifying. So the Nats' first election after the war is 1948. And they come up with, that's when they put up the apartheid thing and they say, guys, vote for us. Don't trust the British. If you vote for them, they're going to do you in. This will become a black country. Vote for us. What we're going to do is take all those black guys that they've brought here from Zululand and Transkei and all these tribal guys, we're going to send them back to where they came from. So that was the policy in 1948. So we will send them back.
So I hear two. Just a quick comment. I hear tremendous psychological impact of the realization of lack of home rule. Their self-rule clearly did not apply because their own guy was fired. Hertzog was fired. And the second thing was that we had a meltdown of or a consequence of the segregation system.
Yeah.
And they saw this is what
this is what it's going to look like.
Segregation.
This is where we're going to. Yes.
When the one polity, people forced in together, but with passes and all this sort of business. This is the consequence.
Yes.
So they vote in an apartheid government, a pro-apartheid government with an apartheid policy.
Yep.
What happens? Because clearly it does not come
and they
to
only
fruition.
just get across the line. It's like really. In fact, they still don't get enough votes. They have to form a coalition with another guy to get them across. It was actually a coalition government. They still didn't get enough votes.
Right. So now we're at 948. They've won.
They've won.
And why didn't they just institute apartheid?
Okay. Well, for one thing,
why not?
They aren't a majority government. I mean, so the National Party doesn't win a majority of seats in Parliament. They rely on a guy called Haafenga. He's a very moderate guy, and he quite likes the Brits. And he goes like, no, I don't want the Empire to go, and I don't want the Queen to go, for example. See, so it was actually called the Afrikaner Party that he ran. And so they had to pay attention to that, obviously. So that's why they couldn't just go, let's just go for it. Okay. So that was part of the reason. So for the 1950s, they were on thin ice. They always thought they could lose the election at any time. Part of the reason. But then what happened is Malan, the Prime Minister, DF Malan, the guy who I said was a preacher man, he came from the Cape. And so he'd grown up in the Cape. And although his policy was, we don't like the Empire, we want our own country and everything, he, for example, believed very strongly in the Westminster system. He never wanted that to go away. He thought that was a really good thing. He was a true Democrat. And so he didn't actually want to shake things up as much as some of the more radical guys in his own party did. And he held it back. All right. It was like, we'll get there. We got lots of time. What's the problem? For example, they didn't declare a republic until 1961. Now, that had been one of their main things. We'll have a republic straight up. Bang. Queen goes, they didn't do it.
It took them 13 years. That's
right. I mean, that tells you everything. So that they focused on, in fact, their initial focus was on dealing with Afrikaner cultural problems. So this is what they did. If you just look at the initial history of what they do, they deal with what they deem as the social problems. There is this large Afrikaner underclass living in these slums. They demolish the slums. They put huge energy into that. They literally demolish slum clearance because these are mixed race slums. And that's when they create black townships. So they move blacks into black townships, whites into suburbs. They just move people into different areas. They break up these slums and demolish them. Also because they say these are breeding places for communism, which they are. And so we're going to get rid of those places. Okay. So they put a lot of energy into that. They build. Now remember, they're saying, what do we do about Afrikaner poverty? By this stage, 25% of Afrikaners are dirt poor, living in slums. They go, we're going to do something about this. And they go, we can't just, they don't do what a communist would do, which is just give them money. Okay, we're going to fix it, like the way what the ANC try to do. We're not just going to give them jobs. That's not going to work. Because these are actually these kind of rural people who are now in urban areas, and they can't do it, actually. So what are we going to do? And they said, we can't fix them, but we can fix their kids. Now remember, Verwoerd was a social work professor. Okay, and in fact, a lot of the guys, the theorists, were social work professors. So they were trying to deal with it as a social work problem. Like, what do we do here? And they were working with the church, because churches normally have social workers attached. So in fact, the Dutch Reformed Church got in on this as well. And they said, how do we uplift these people? And they said, okay, we will give them jobs, but we will give them menial jobs, because that's all they can do. So they gave them all jobs in the railways, for example. So all these guys were given jobs, because there were lots of jobs in the railways. They were expanding the railways. They were expanding the iron ore work. They created these jobs for these guys, and they gave them enough of a salary that they said, we can uplift their kids and we create schools and colleges for their children. So it's a generational thing. They will always stay buggered, but their children will be fixed. And they literally upgraded all these people's kids. So it was a project of educate them into jobs for the future and get them out of that situation. But don't just instantly think you can give them everything and it's all going to be fixed up. So it was a very different model, okay, of state intervention. Because that cost taxpayers money. So that's actually what they were doing in the 1950s. They were building schools, Afrikaans universities, Afrikaans colleges, educating these guys, and then fixing their kids and moving them to the next level up. That's where they've put the focus.
Well, Afrikaans from 1948 actually controlled the state.
Exactly.
Their representatives controlled
Precisely.
the state. So
that's what they were doing. They were using the state to build this network because you must, and then they also started building black schools. During the British Empire never built a single school for black people. Not one. All schooling for black people was done by the missions. And in fact, if you look at all the ANC activists, they all came from mission schools. Black people called them mission blacks because that's where they got westernized. And that's where they learned socialism. All these other ideas, okay?
So we're post-1948, we're entering the 1950s, and the Boers are in control, the Afrikaners are in control, but they don't achieve the ultimate goals. Can you take us from there?
Now remember, Verwoerd was one of the original thinkers back in the 30s, so he's got the plan in his mind, as opposed to the people who ran the country in the 1950s, who were politicians as opposed to thinkers. Verwoerd becomes the prime minister in the late 90s, in the late 50s, 1958, 58, 9, something like that. And there's a transformation immediately, because now what he wants to do is to put the plan into place. And he says so. And he's the first, he kind of comes and says, okay, now we're getting busy. And he coins the idea of separate development. And he goes, we're going to create these separate countries. And we are going to develop black people in their own countries. So we're going to create these countries. We're going to create an education system to help them, et cetera, et cetera. And he announces that, and he calls it separate development. Now, as soon as he starts to do that, now, because his timing, of course, externally is a bit of a shocker, because this is exactly when decolonization is happening. So the pressures from outside are pretty serious now. I mean, the Indians in particular, India is now independent, and they're creating huge turmoil within the Commonwealth. The Afro-Asian bloc is coming into being. UN is getting in on the act. So there's a lot of external pressure coming onto the South Africans at this stage. But Verwoerd is the kind of guy, he's a really tough nut. I mean, he really is a tough man. Scared the hell out of everybody, basically, in his own team. Because he's brutal as a politician. And he kind of goes, no, we're just going to do this. Like, I'm not buggering around anymore. But he realized the pressures that were on him. Okay? 1960s is when he tries to roll this out now. And what happens is he confronts problems because remember, he's running it as, this is a democracy. From a white point of view, there is a parliamentary democracy in place. You have an opposition, and you have constituencies, white constituencies, who don't want this apartheid stuff. Now, the biggest pressure that came on Verwoerd was, in fact, the liberal business sector. Okay, so Anglo businessmen who own the economy, most of the economies is run by Anglos. And they certainly don't want apartheid. This is the most ghastly idea they've ever heard of. Because basically what Verwoerd is going to do is take their cheap labor away from them. And he's now starting to do it. That's the other point. He's not just talking about it now. Verwoerd is now building the migration system, because he realizes that if you're going to relocate people back to the homelands, you have to have a policing mechanism to do this. And so there is a policing mechanism built that can go around and find black guys. Where's your pass? Are you allowed to be here? No. They were arresting black guys as illegal migrants. Not a be here, don't have a pass, you're out. And they would just send them back to wherever they came from. Okay. So black guys are now starting to be taken out of factories. White businessmen are starting to actually lose their labor. And in fact, they didn't put up resistance. So the business sector put up resistance to the Nats, going, "You're crazy people." Okay. And so Verwoerd got really heavy with them, and he imposed fines on them. So they would raid a business and go and check out the business. And if your workers weren't supposed to be there, not only would they arrest them and send them back, you would be charged as the businessman, like, "What's this dude doing on your factory floor?" So he got quite heavy with them.
So what Oli was doing was saying, now it's time for
absolutely, we've got to get serious now. Yeah,
and do away with segregation. Absolutely.
So for saying we're not doing the segregation thing now, we're doing separate development. We're doing apartheid properly.
Different nations.
We're breaking these guys, and by now they've actually they've demarcated the places. They've really kind of said, okay, this Yas KwaZulu, Yas Transkei, Yas Ciskei, etc., etc. They started the rudiments of the state formation. So they got a parliament. They built a parliament and created bureaucracy, and these places were given their own education systems and their own hospital system and their own health system and universities sometimes, etc., etc. They were building all these things for them, which of course also annoyed the businessmen because they were paying the taxes to build all this stuff, and they were just incensed. Not only are you taking my workers away from me, but on top of it, you're taxing me to build all this infrastructure, okay, for black people. What's wrong with you? Okay. But Verwoerd just is, he's going ahead. But he's also having, he's now also having problems from Afrikaner farmers, because the original, the plan for this separation is you start off with the original reserves. Okay, so like in America, you got the reserves for the Indians. Well, you had the same in South Africa. I think you had them in Australia as well, didn't you? So the British had created an initial system of reserves, and those are the basis for the homelands. It's the initial territory that is allocated. However, the guy who's designed the apartheid system is this guy called Werner Eiselin, and he's kind of going, no, if you're going to do this seriously, you got to create proper, viable states, and that's not enough land for them. You actually got to add a whole bunch of land. We've got to get serious here and create viable states for black people. And that means taking an awful lot of white guys' farms away and adding it to these things. Okay. Right. Now, because as soon as you start that, now your farmers are going, no, not in my backyard, not my farm. I don't like this idea at all. Okay. And so they were putting up resistance. So the agricultural unions, the trade unions for the farmers are now going, no. And of course, these are actually his voters. These are guys on his team. So it's inside the party where he's now meeting some resistance. Okay. It's like, yeah, we like the idea, but only up to a point. And basically what he's going is, yeah, but if we're going to do it properly, we have to do it properly. Okay. It's also, of course, the 60s is when black resistance starts. So you've now got the ANC's got going. Mandela's set up Umkhonto we Sizwe, so you've got a terrorist organization blowing things up. So you got urban black resistance, because it's urban black people who you're sending out of the place, right? Mm-hmm. They putting up resistance. So Verwoerd's getting it from a lot of different, and he's got the overseas guys, he's got the UN on his case, he's got the Commonwealth on his case, etc. Now, inside the National Party, there's already people going, oops, this is getting a bit heavier. Verwoerd is a guy who goes, no, I'm serious. You don't understand, guys. We don't actually have a choice here. If we don't do this now, because we have the power. Right now, we're in charge, and despite all this noise, we have the power, we can push this through. The Republic has happened, okay? And so he's kind of going, we really are, as this is hegemonic as we're ever going to be. Let's do it. Now, apparently what he was going to do is, so people inside the national body have told me that this is what was going to happen. And they said that Verwoerd had realized that he had to play rough and that he was going to declare a state of emergency. So he was going to say, this is literally a state of emergency. And democracy is proving to be a problem. You guys are blocking me in the parliament here, and I can't get anything done.
And it's a matter of survival.
And this is literally survival. I'm going to declare a state of emergency and abrogate all powers unto myself, and I'm going to ram this damn thing through. That's it. it turns out that the day he was going to make, now Verwoerd was a guy who never made notes. He didn't have notes. He didn't make his speeches from notes, just off the top of his head.
Wow.
So he went in to make the speech, and that was the day he got assassinated. Bang. So rotten luck. So there you go. Anyway, the guy that replaced him was a guy called Forster, who was a compromiser. He just was one of those guys who's a political negotiator, and he wasn't a tough. He was just not a tough. Ironically, he was put in because they thought he was a really tough guy. He was put in because they thought he was the next tough guy. But when push came to shove, he fell over every time. And so every time a problem. So if we just take the business sector, for example, he was the guy who, when the business guys came to him and said, "No, you can't take our labor away from us. It's outrageous." Okay, he went, "Oh, yeah, no, I see your point. That is a bit harsh." So he then said, "Okay, like I tell you what, I'll come up with a compromise." And the compromise he came up with was that he said, he created a thing called border industries. So he said, we're not going to have these black guys in Johannesburg or in Durban or in Cape Town or in Port Elizabeth, not in our cities. Those are white cities. We don't want these black guys there. But what we'll do is you will relocate your factory from Johannesburg to the border of the Homelands. Right on the border.
It's a version of segregation.
It really sort of is, yeah. So black guys now live on their side of the border.
Sort of within the one polity, really.
Oh, no. They were going to give independence.
Okay.
No. They weren't. He didn't actually give up on the idea of homelands and independence. That he was still going to have. Okay. But it was going to be, then what we'll do is we'll put the factories on the South African side of the border, if you see what I mean. And we'll build, and they built these huge black cities. They're still there today. They are still massive. There are millions and millions of black people living in these black cities just inside what were the homeland boundaries. And then the factories on the other side in South Africa. And every day the black guys would commute over the border. Okay. So you technically at night be in your own country and your own citizenship and vote there, but you come over and work in South Africa. Nice. And he kind of sold that to businessmen. They don't like it because they don't like rebuilding their factories, but at least they still had their black labor force and could, that sort of thing. So you can see that's the kind of compromise that he came up with. But at the same time, he didn't expand the homelands. So that stopped. He didn't. The pressure from the farmers was too. So the homelands just got frozen in that state. So they became kind of. It was easy for someone who was trying to nail apartheid, going, "You're not really serious. I mean, that's not a proper country."
Exactly what I wanted to ask you to clarify. So Verwoerd wanted larger homelands.
Yeah.
But he was assassinated before he could do it.
Yeah.
Which answers the challenge, as you say, from critics of apartheid, which was these homelands is really exploitation. Look how small they are. These are not serious.
That's right.
So the plan was, the vision was to have them real serious homelands.
So the model, the Aislinn model, the guy who developed this thing originally, I mean, if you look at what he was talking about, you would have given away the whole northern Transvaal.
Wow.
You would have given away the whole of Natal. You would have given away the whole of the Eastern Cape. I mean, that's it. So in fact, South Africa would have shrunk to basically the Cape Province, where there were no black people anyway at that stage, and then it would have been like the Highveld. So it would have been really the area, the Highveld from, say, Bloemfontein up to Pretoria. That's South Africa would stop
with Cape Town.
Yeah, with Cape Town as
a corridor coming up.
Basically.
Okay.
That's right. That's what South Africa would have been. So
you've got the seaport and so on.
So that's what would have been left. And so you would have given away. And in terms of arable land, remember, South Africa is like Australia. It's mostly a desert. Okay. And in fact, if you look at the part of South Africa that was to be kept by the whites, they were keeping the desert, actually. There wasn't a lot of the arable land they were going to be keeping. Most of the really good arable land was going to be given to these homelands. So if Aislinn's model had been put into place, you would have had viable functional states, and that's what didn't happen.
So South Africa, I'll give you a parallel hypothesis. Tell me what you think. So South Africa got to the stage in 1900 where Australia was formulating the White Australia policy, which said we're going to remain a white country with some minorities, but overwhelmingly a white country. It got to that stage and just didn't get there. Just didn't didn't form their own country. They remained a segregated, intermixed, which actually had no long-term future for the white nation. No long-term future.
Well, in fact, they didn't manage to pull it apart. In other words, it was like trying to unscramble an egg. That's what you were going to have to do. And they couldn't do it. They discovered that. And if we add to that now, the problem that it comes. Back in the 1950s, there was he was actually a journalist and he was a novelist and a fairly reasonable sort of philosopher as well. But he was a journalistic kind of guy. Okay, had the same name as me. His name was Eric Louw, very famous Afrikaans author in the 1950s, and supported apartheid. He liked this idea. But in the 1950s, he wrote this really interesting piece in which he said he predicted that at some point in the future, he said, this is a radical survival plan that we have designed here. Apartheid is a plan for our survival, but it might not work. It's touch and go if we can make this happen. This is pretty radical stuff to make this actually happen. Okay, and the reason because he even said, you can question this at a moral level. You can go, we're going to disrupt a lot of people's lives. We're going to hurt a lot of black people to do this. So already we're starting to ask ourselves, we're Christians, do we want to do this? And he asked those questions. All right. And he said, but it's a radical survival plan. And despite the fact as Christians, we think this might not be that nice a thing to do, it's our survival. And he was just after the Second World War. This was in like 1951, I think he said. And he said, if we don't do this, we will be as helpless as the Jews were in Germany. We just have to do this. Otherwise, we're done. So that's why I support it. But we have to make sure we actually do it now. And then he said, I predict that if we discover at some point in the future, in like 20 odd years, 30 years time, that we haven't managed to pull this off, we're going to look into the abyss. It's going to be our dark night of horror when we ask ourselves, now what? It's not working. We're inflicting pain on people. Can we honestly carry on doing this? Is this a Christian thing to do? Or do we give it up? And I predict one day that might just happen.
Well, surely it's happening.
No, but that's what I'm saying. So he said that back in the 50s.
Right.
And he wrote a book saying this. And what happened is in the late 70s, it was indeed in the late 70s, when this is exactly what happened.
The thing began falling apart.
Well, it wasn't yet obvious it wasn't yet obvious that it was falling apart. But what was happening is that, okay, so if you were a cabinet minister, if you were in the cabinet and you'd ask for statistics and say, what they discovered is that they hadn't managed to create a single magistratal district where whites were the majority, not one. And they go, oh, jeez, we've been trying this hard. It's not. This is pretty serious stuff. Maybe we can't. So what happened is in the late 70s, the intellectuals started turning against them, their own intellectuals. So people at the universities and journalists and academics started asking these questions. And in fact, referring back to Van Wyk Louw and saying, Van Wyk Louw told us that we were going to, look into the abyss. Well, we reached the abyss. And now what do we do? Because by now, because the other thing that happened is the Portuguese Empire had collapsed. Frelimo had taken over Mozambique. This gave the ANC direct conduit in. The war had started in Angola, so they were now actually fighting a war. So the war had got going now. They were now fighting a war. The Soviets had arrived. The Cubans were fighting a war now. So it's looking bad, okay? And repression, there hadn't been repression before. Repression only starts from the 80s, really. If you really look at it, there wasn't, in Sharpeville, there was that one kind of shooting that happened. But other than that, you're not going to find a lot of, they just didn't do that kind of thing, okay? But now, getting to the 70s, with Frelimo, the war hots up, terrorists are on the place, Rhodesia's collapsing, okay? It's all coming to pieces, okay? And they're not managing to create these separate countries. And the intellectuals start to say, it's not Christian to do this. it's like what are we going to do? Can we live with ourselves if we're just going to become brutal dictators and just repress? Because that's what we originally said we didn't want to do. Aren't we just going to be doing that in another form? This is what we want? The questions were then posed. And it didn't take long for intellectuals to just abandon them. So now they didn't have intellectuals on their side. Their own intellectuals said, no, it's not working, guys. Now, at that point, the National Party realized they had to change. So, in fact, the National Party, and Verwoerd at this stage was thrown out. Okay. He was, for a whole bunch of reasons, he got purged internally. Because he wasn't delivering. Okay. And it's Verwoerd. Foster, sorry. Foster. So Foster's not delivering, so they purge him. Okay. And the guy that comes into place is a guy called P.W. Botha. Now P.W. Botha is another, he's an interesting guy because he's one of the reformers. Okay. The National Party splits into two camps. They call the enlightened ones and the dogmatic ones, roughly translating something like that. Okay, and the reformers, this P.W. Botha is one of the reformers who goes, the old model of apartheid has not worked. We're never going to do it. We're never going to pull people apart. This idea of separate states is clearly, we missed the boat, baby. Okay, so we have to try something else, but we're not going to give up on white people yet. We still think there's a way to do this. And what they do is they turn to this model called consociationalism, which is a polymer. It's like, it's a little bit like the closest you can come to is to say the way Switzerland, it's not quite, but the Swiss cantons are sort of little ethnic cantons and then they federate together, that sort of idea. And Belgium as well is structured a little bit like that. So in Belgium, you have the Flemish bits and the French bits, and then they federate together, that sort of idea. That's what we have to do here. We actually have to create a system where we got these different ethnic groups, and remember, we've got these homelands. They stay there. We've created them. So, because one of them, the Zulu one, refused to be independent. That was the other disaster. Oh, that was an absolute catastrophe for them because the Zulus are the largest ethnic group, and ironically, Buthelezi, who's the head of the Zulu homeland, on the one hand, he's their greatest ally. In fact, he was the last person in South Africa to defend apartheid. There's the irony. It was two black guys defended apartheid after the National Party had abandoned it. There was an irony for you, okay?
That's amazing.
But Buthelezi he kind of goes with this because he's a black Zulu nationalist. And he goes, you're giving me my country. Thank you. I think that's a great idea. But I don't want independence. I want to remain inside South Africa as a Zulu entity. So I want a kind of confederal system of ethnic groups, okay, which is kind of consociationism. And they buy that eventually. They go, well, if the Zulus won't take independence, even if we got everybody else to, and even if we could separate people, we don't have a white state. So we've lost anyway. So that's when the National Party shifts to this consociational model, which is a kind of constitution. You create a whole different kind of parliament, which is a federation of ethnic groups. Okay. But it protects minority rights because it's a confederation of ethnic groups. And then you have a rotating presidency. And the presidency, so the country is governed by an executive council. And the executive council consists of the leaders of each of the ethnic groups. And then there's a rotating presidency amongst them, if you get the idea. So, and a confederation is slightly looser even than a federation, so that your ethnic group continues to have a space for itself. Okay, so that's what the National Party was trying to do. So that's the reform, and P.W. Botha is the guy who's going to do that for them. But he's a really hard-assed guy as well. But he's a hard-assed reformer.
This has still got elements of segregation though now, because you've still got the past system. You've still got it's very messy now. It's messy.
It's very, but okay, they haven't got a clear model anymore. Now they haven't got a model. They're trying to create a model, and in fact, they create a Department of Constitutional Affairs where they put all their brightest minds, and their brightest minds go, and then they're trying to find out, what do we do here? How can we design a system that can stop this? We have to stop this, because by now it's become clear that the British Empire has indeed done exactly what they said it would do. It's created a country where there is now a majority of semi-westernized black people in the country, and it's visible, and there they are in front of you. And they are indeed demanding that they want the country now. So the worst fate has befallen exactly what those people predicted would happen. It is in your face now. And they go, well, how do we stop this? How do we create some space for ourselves? Okay. And that's what P.W. Botha is trying to do. Now, he then, the political scientist Huntington, you know Huntington, the American guy?
Yes.
Okay, well, Huntington works very closely with P.W. Botha. And it's about because Botha says, I'm going to reform the system and I want to build reform and create blah, 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 blah. And Huntington says, yes, but as soon as you start to reform a system, all hell's going to break loose because they're going to think you're weak and it's going to be really chaotic. So you're going to go through a period of at least a decade when it's going to be totally chaotic and you're going to have to apply massive repression. That's the only way you're going to maintain your control. Okay, so Huntington explains this to them. And Huntington was going around talking to all their guys and working with their consociational guys. And so Botha says, yeah, okay, that's what we're doing. He builds a thing called, in South Africa, they call the securocrats. So he builds this, he creates, the securocrats speaks for what it is. It's security bureaucrats. Okay, so it's like a whole bureaucracy of security people, the security police, the military, the police, et cetera, and all military. Just this, usually it's a security state. Okay. And he more or less takes power away from politicians, from his own politicians.
This
Parliament
is the late
1980s. This is the 1980s. So the 1980s are a period when all power is concentrated in the presidency, where he is. So the president now has more or less executive control, and he governs the country through the securocrats, and Parliament is bypassed, and the National Party is bypassed. You get the idea, okay? But he is actually getting it right. I mean, he's rolling out the reforms and trying to experiment and find the way to do it. But at the same time, it does indeed trigger mass rebellion, and those are the images you get of the 1980s. Of people being shot in the streets. I mean, it's just chaos. Yeah, because it was war. It's now warfare. It's warfare on the ground. But that's what you're doing. The UDF, the left, the ANC thought, you guys are done. We can, you're doing this because you're weak. But the irony is he wasn't weak. He was incredibly strong because he'd worked it all out. I mean, the securocrats, he said it himself, and it's true. He could have built a security state, and the securocrats could have been in power now. There's no question. There's no way these guys could have got them out. They were absolutely in control. Okay, but it's no longer a democracy. Okay, and he beat the hell out of them. Because the other thing that Botha did is he formed alliances with black conservatives. That's what he did. It wasn't just a white thing. In fact, the 1980s, the image that the outside world has of South Africa is that this was a black-white civil war. No, it really wasn't. It truly wasn't. It was the most multiracial period in the country's history because you were fighting a war, and it was a war between left wing and right wing. That's what the 1980s actually were. Okay. And Botha cobbled together a right wing alliance system, and the ANC cobbled together a left wing alliance system. And both teams were multiracial. Both teams had whites and blacks on them. So you had black people in the South African, in fact, the South African military was mostly black then, and the police were mostly black. And you had these black politicians like Buthelezi and Mangopi and Opakoza and so who were fighting for apartheid because they were going, yeah, we want our ethnic groups. So this is an alliance of ethnic groups, as opposed to the ANC UDF who are going, we want a single unified country where everybody has the vote in one country.
So what we have now is a single unified country where everyone has a vote, and you have ANC dominance.
Exactly.
Okay. And ethnic voting blocks and so on. But now during the 1980s, how we got there? But now during the 1980s, you've still got all those intellectuals and journalists. So that the National Party lost its intellectual class because they're referring back to Van Wyk Low and going, we're being really brutal, guys. This is nasty stuff. Because remember, all whites being called up. I went to the army. I was there. I fought the buggers. I was on both sides at the same time. I mean, there's the irony. And there were lots of people like me. Because it was like Israel now. Israel is calling up left-wing people who don't like Netanyahu. And when they're in the army, they're fighting for Netanyahu, aren't they? Well, it was exactly the same in South Africa.
So there were lots of lefty guys. I was in a Marxist reading group in DHQ. Okay. It's bizarre, okay? But it was that kind of thing that was going on. And you had this left-wing, right-wing civil, it was a war between left-wing and right-wing, and they were both multiracial. As one of my cousins who was a security policeman, and he said to me, I fought in the trenches with black people, we fought together, there was no racism. We were on the same team. And I remember going to one army camp, when I was one of the ones I was called up to. And I went to this army camp, and in the army camp, there was a huge swimming pool, huge, like about two Olympic-sized pool, enormous thing. Now, this is in the middle of, when you saw those images in the 1980s of black, what you thought were black people and white people killing each other. And I went there, and there were black kids and white kids swimming in the pool, in this South African army pool. And I even said to the dude, hey, check that out. And he said, it's ons swartes. They are blacks. Their fathers are fighting for us. They're on our team. There's no racism here. You see, that says everything, doesn't it? And it was like that. And it was the same on the other side as well. In other words, the 1980s were a period when there really was no racism, because neither side could be racist, because both sides were multiracial and had to be effectively non-racial. It was the most non-racial period in South African history.
Things have moved on since
absolutely.
Would you like to characterize the end point and quickly go through how we got there?
Then the next stage that happens was Peter Botha has a stroke. When he has a stroke, this guy, the Klerk, comes in as the president. The Klerk is a true believer in democracy and in Westminster democracy. So he's been one of the people, he's a really right-wing guy. He's one of the most right-wing national. Oh, and sorry, the other thing is when this reform stuff started to happen, the consociational thing, half of the National Party's people left the National Party. So half of the National Party split into two, and half of them became the Conservative Party, who are the old Verwoerdians who say, we're not giving up on this. We still want to try and do this. We don't think it's over yet. But the National Party now goes into consociationalism. Yeah? But now the National Party relies on English-speaking voters to come into power. Because now English-speaking people go, oh, you've reformed yourself, all good. Okay. And so they all move into that. So in fact, that 1980s was a period of rapprochement, also complete rapprochement between English and Afrikaans. And they're all going to the army together. So everybody's now speaking English and Afrikaans and mixing languages, and all that old stuff just disappears. Now, the Klerk takes over. And because he's a Democrat, he's always been appalled at how Botha was undemocratic, how he took power away from Parliament, how he just they were a rubber stamp. They had no power. And he hated the Securocrats. He hated the military. And he's also a very Christian guy. So, in fact, the Klerk's, I won't get into that. But yeah, he kind of was deeply Christian guy, and he's going, we're hurting people now. We're killing people. And we're doing it for something we know we can't even win. Why are we doing this? Apartheid, we know it's not going to work, and we're still killing people. This is outrageous. Why are we doing this? Okay. So when he comes to power, it also just happens to be when the Berlin Wall goes down, which is an absolutely seminal event there. Because the ANC is funded by the Soviet Union. The main funders for the ANC were always East Germany and Czechoslovakia. That's where the money comes from. Okay. With some coming from the Soviet Union as well. And so he knows this. He knows where the money's coming from. And now the Berlin Wall comes down. And the security cops go to the Klerk and they say, we got them. We got them now. They got no money. They got no guns. They're done. Okay. Soviet Union just went down on them. This is the moment we negotiate with them when they're weak. We can get what we want out of them now. So that's when he unbans the ANC and stuff. Says, come hither, and we will now negotiate. Now, the National Party's internal plan was to go to the negotiations and sell consociational democracy. So it's this it's really complex, but it's kind of a ethnic federation. It's an ethnic confederation which according to the National Party doesn't even have to be South Africa anymore. They kind of want to widen this. They want to bring Botswana and Namibia and Zimbabwe and all these places in because why not? Let's have a whole Southern African Confederation. But within this, we can still secure space for white guys. We will still control we'll control our own cultural space. We won't control the whole thing, but they'll never be able to take that away from us. We'll still have our own schools and universities and stuff like that. That's kind of as good as we can get here. Okay? And that's what the National Party approves for the National Party to take to the constitutional negotiations. So now the constitutional negotiations start from 1991. Now what happened is that if you look at the negotiations, you can divide them clearly into just two parts. First part of the negotiations, the National Party is winning everything. They're running circles around the goddamn ANC. Because the ANC are in a shambles. Remember, they've all just come back. A lot of their negotiations have just come back from East Berlin. They're horrified and they really are traumatized. Okay. National Party is running circles around these dudes. And is winning every point. And the ANC now realizes that they're in trouble. The de facto main negotiator on the ANC's team was a guy called Joe Slovo, who's the head of the Communist Party. He's a white guy. He's a Jewish guy. Okay. And he goes to the ANC and says, we're done, guys. They're winning. If they get this up, if they get this constitution up, they're trying to get us to approve here, we're done. They've won. Okay. We've got to stop this. And so, no, the ANC calls it the Leipzig option. And they do exactly in East Germany on South Africa. Because they've just come from East Germany. And they saw how the East German government was brought down. They go, we'll do the same thing here. We'll cause chaos. Absolute chaos. Mm-hmm. So they unleash the Leipzig option on South Africa, which is make it completely ungovernable. Just chaos from one end of the country to the other. Now, the Nats had allowed the MK guys to come and the guerrillas to come back and they brought their guns with them, etc. They just went mad. And so now what happened is, remember, you've got this alliance because the Nats had built up a right-wing alliance with a whole bunch of black guys. Okay. They were called, in fact, in South Africa at the time, they called them the Wit Dukke and the Rooi Dukke. Dukke is the bandolier that you tie around your head. So in all the townships split into right and left. And the conservatives wore white bandanas and the commies wore red bandanas. And they were killing each other on the streets. I mean, shooting each other. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it was like a real civil war now. But then what happened is the lefties, ANC guys, etc., you had the Democrats in power in America who kind of leaned to the left. The liberal journalists leaned to the left. And the media, the global media, backed the ANC. Because Mandela was Saint Mandela. He was a good guy. And he was a liberal, apparently. They didn't realize he was a commie. I mean, they really didn't. And so they backed these guys. At that point, up until then, as I understand it, the British had been within the Western alliance structure, the NATO, etc. Each of these countries gets given a part of the world that they're responsible for kind of managing it for everybody else. And South Africa had been given to the Brits. So the Brits were always the guys who had to manage the South African problem for everybody else. And at this point, the overall alliance, the Americans are going, these Nats have just got to go. This is unacceptable. We've got Saint Mandela. We should just crown the guy now, for God's sakes. Okay. At that point, the Brits go, we're washing our hands of this then. We're not playing this here. So the British withdraw and say, okay, you do it then. They hand it over to the Americans. The Americans send a new ambassador out there, a guy called Lyman, who, it's when I just found this, because I read his book. I got his book. And when I read it, it was truly fascinating. One little anecdote that I can throw in there is that now Joe Slovo, okay, his parents are Jewish migrants from Lithuania. So most South African Jews are Lithuanian. Okay. Turns out that this guy, the American ambassador who they sent to South Africa to sort it out, his parents are Lithuanian Jews. And he turns out he's related to Joe Slovo. Okay. So they discover each other at a Jewish cafe in Yeovil in Johannesburg. And they're having a chat now. And well, discover each other, and they become buddies. And the American ambassador sides with the ANC, unambiguously.
Key event.
Key event. There it is. And so he announces halfway through the negotiations, and remember, now, when this turmoil is broken loose, people are not killing each other on the streets, the Nats don't know what to do. Because do they now really unleash their military? Because their military is saying, let us go kill these guys. It's no problem. We can do that. We can fix this all. But now the whole world's watching now at this stage. The Nats have lost their intellectuals who are going, we shouldn't be killing people. That's not Christian. So now, and the Klerk himself doesn't think it's a good idea to kill people. He really doesn't. He's horrified by military, what the military be doing to kill people. He just thinks it's appalling. So he has a chat with the American ambassador. He says, your military are a problem. You should demobilize them. So he does. He demolishes his own military. He disbands them. He fires all his generals. Okay. It's done. And then the ambassador gets up and makes a speech and says, this consociationalist stuff's far too complex. It's bullshit. Let's just have a straight... Look, we know what democracy is in America. Democracy is everybody gets one vote. It's a majoritarian thing. You have two political parties. That's democracy. Just do what we did, for God's sakes. And the ANC says, yeah, we like that. Okay, fine, they're on our side. That's it. Bang. Done.
Thanks for watching. Professor Louw's fascinating history lesson reminds us of the dangers of complacency. Many white South Africans today are trapped in a terrifying situation which is deteriorating. They have become a hated, marginalised minority discriminated against by the government in their own country. This could have been avoided, but to do so would have required difficult belt-tightening under the leadership of loyal elites. It may be too late to save South Africa. It is not too late to save Australia. The British Australian community is fighting against those who seek to tear down our Western European Christian-based society, which, whilst not perfect, has been the basis of our amazing country. The legitimate interests of white people as a whole are under attack. The right to have our own country, the right to have our children taught pride in that country, and much more. The British Australian community represents and advocates for the collective interests of all European-descended Australians. If we don't defend them, who will? Membership currently works out at rather less than $1 per week. If you want to do more, we would love to hear from you. We'll put the links in the description and look forward to seeing you as a member.
This video has been proudly produced by the British Australian community.